Welcome to This Explainer. You know, you'd think that after World War II finally ended, the world would catch a break, right? Well, actually, the dust had barely settled before the battle lines for a totally new, silent war were drawn. Today, we're looking at the very first major crisis of the Cold War, the Berlin Airlift. This was an absolutely massive, completely unprecedented operation. It's really this incredible story about how a defeated enemy was transformed into a democratic ally, and how the political map of Europe was effectively cemented for the next 4 decades. Okay, let's dive into this, because it is just an impossible dilemma. Picture this. It's 1948. You have 2.5 million people who are completely cut off from the rest of the world. No food coming in, no fuel, no medicine. And surrounding them is the Soviet Union, a newly minted superpower that is definitely not thrilled you're there. You have to save these millions of residents, but if you make even one wrong military move, you risk instantly sparking World War III. So how on earth do you solve that? Well, to really get the gravity of this puzzle, we first need to take a look at the geography of post-war Germany. What's really interesting about this layout is how the trap was actually set. After the war, Germany was carved up into 4 occupation zones. You had the American, British, French, and Soviet zones. But if you zoom in on Berlin, the capital city, it was sitting deep inside the Soviet zone. And because it was so important, Berlin itself was also chopped up into those same 4 sectors. So West Berlin was effectively this isolated island of democracy, totally surrounded by the Soviet occupation zone. It was a geopolitical pressure cooker just waiting to go off. And the spark that finally lit that fuse came in June of 1948. The Western Allies decided they were going to introduce a brand new currency, the Deutschmark, in their zones. The goal was pretty straightforward, just jumpstart the struggling West German economy. But Soviet leader Joseph Stalin saw this economic move as a direct threat to his vision of a weakened, communist-aligned Germany. So, on June 24th, Stalin retaliated. He abruptly slammed shut every single rail, road, and water route going into West Berlin. His ultimate goal? Starve those 2.5 million residents into submission and force the Western Allies to completely abandon the city. Suddenly, the Western Allies are backed into a corner, and they really only have 3 choices. Option 1, surrender the city to the Soviets, but that would be a massive strategic and ideological defeat. Option 2, try to punch through the blockade with an armed convoy on the ground, which, as we know, carried the very real immediate risk of starting World War III. Or Option 3, just fly the supplies right over the blockade. U.S. General Lucius D. Clay and the British planners looked at these incredibly dire options and actually chose the seemingly impossible third route. And that wild decision birthed Operation Vittles. It was this massive 11-month humanitarian and military airlift designed to supply the entire western half of Berlin completely from the sky. I mean, just think about the audacity of that for a second. Supplying a modern, ruined metropolis of millions with absolutely everything they need to survive, from the food they eat to the coal that heats their homes, using only airplanes. It was a logistical miracle, the likes of which the world had literally never seen. To keep a whole city alive, these planes couldn't just drop off supplies once a day. They had to create a literal conveyor belt in the sky, and this brilliantly illustrates that crazy rhythm. Pilots would approach Berlin, land at Tempelhof Airport, unload their cargo with lightning speed, and immediately take off again to go get more. At the absolute peak of the operation, an Allied plane was landing at Tempelhof every 45 seconds. Let that sink in. Every 45 seconds, 24 hours a day and night, no matter the weather. Over the course of the whole operation, this relentless aerial chain delivered over 2.3 million tons of cargo. And what was actually in those planes? Absolute necessities. The isolated Berliners were basically surviving on airdropped dried potatoes, powdered milk, and canned meats. But it wasn't just food, right? The city needed electricity and warmth to survive the bitter winter, which meant heavy, dirty coal was loaded onto these aircraft and flown in by the ton. The sheer scale of moving 2.3 million tons by air back in 1948 is just mind-blowing. But, a miracle of this magnitude does not happen without immense effort and sacrifice. The blockade and the resulting airlift lasted for 322 days. In that time, the Allies flew an astonishing 278,228 total flights. But we also really have to recognize the grave human cost here. Flying constantly in these tight corridors, often in terrible weather, was incredibly dangerous. 101 people lost their lives due to accidents during the operation. That includes 70 British and 31 American personnel, who who made the ultimate sacrifice just to keep the city of Berlin alive. Let's move to and see how this builds, because while Operation Vittles was a huge military and logistical success, it also became this enormous public relations victory for the West. The Allied transport planes filling the skies didn't just carry food, they carried hope. And that massive shift in public perception was largely championed by individual people on the ground, most notably an American pilot named Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen. So, Lieutenant Halvorsen noticed groups of German kids waiting patiently at the edge of Tempelhof Airport, just watching these massive planes land. He wanted to bring them some joy in this bleak, rationed city, so he started a totally rogue initiative. He began dropping small, handmade parachutes fashioned out of handkerchiefs, loaded with chocolate and chewing gum, directly to the kids below. Dubbed Operation Little Vittles, this heartwarming act quickly became a global sensation. It beautifully humanized the American pilots to the very same German population they had been heavily bombing just 3 years prior. It was a real game changer. So, the crucial point is how this incredible, localized effort ultimately reshaped the entire globe. By the spring of 1949, Stalin's plan had clearly failed. The Allies proved they could supply Berlin indefinitely, and the Soviets were facing massive international embarrassment. Finally, on May 12, 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade. But the geopolitical damage was done. The crisis proved to the Western nations that they absolutely needed a permanent military alliance to contain Soviet expansion, which led directly to the formation of NATO in April 1949. Plus, it accelerated the formal split of the country into the Democratic West and the Communist East. Which leaves us with this incredible paradox to ponder. We started with a desperate scramble to drop coal and powdered milk to a starving, blockaded city. Yet, the success of that very humanitarian airdrop became the exact catalyst that permanently cemented the Cold War divide in Europe for the next 40 years. By refusing to surrender, and by achieving a logistical miracle in the skies, the Allies saved Berlin, but they definitely set the stage for a divided world. Thank you for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this sheds some fascinating new light on how logistics can quite literally change the course of history.